I stood there watching $22,000 worth of winter stockpile burn to ash while 4 HOA board members smiled like they'd won something. That wasn't clutter. That was food, fuel, and medical supplies meant to keep my 78-year-old mother alive through a Colorado winter. They called it emergency cleanup. No warning. No appeal. Just fire. That was the moment everything changed. What they didn't realize was that destroying those supplies triggered a clause buried in a 1962 property deed they never bothered to read. I didn't know it yet, but their little victory unlocked control over something far more dangerous than fines or notices. And once I touched it, there was no way to stop what came next. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. By the time the smoke settled, the HOA was already acting like the decision had been made long before the fire ever started. Notices were being printed. Emails were being sent. And I could feel the rules tightening around my property in ways they never had before. I wasn't some recluse or troublemaker. I lived quietly on the edge of Pine Valley Lake, on land my family had owned since the early 1960s. I worked remotely, kept to myself, paid dues on time, and followed the visible rules. Most days were predictable: checking supplies, maintaining the shoreline, making sure my mother was comfortable. Her dementia made routine everything. Stability wasn't a luxury for us. It was survival. That was the part the HOA never seemed interested in. Cheryl Kensington had been HOA president for just under a year, and already the tone of the community had shifted. Meetings became tighter. Notices got sharper. Language like compliance and immediate correction started replacing neighborly reminders. At first, it seemed minor, cosmetic, like a new manager trying to look serious. But there were signs. Unannounced inspections began happening near my lot. Not inside, just close enough to feel deliberate. People I'd waved to for years stopped making eye contact. The lakefront homes, newer, taller, more expensive, were suddenly the center of every HOA update. Pine Valley was changing, and I was sitting on one of the few remaining parcels that didn't match the new image. My winter stockpile had always been there. Properly stored. Out of sight from the road. Fire safe. Documented. The county had inspected it twice over the years and signed off. The HOA knew it existed. They'd even referenced it casually in older newsletters as an example of off-grid preparedness. That should have protected it. It didn't. The first notice arrived taped to my gate 3 days before the fire. No certified mail. No call. Just a single-page violation marked urgent. It cited unauthorized storage materials and referenced an emergency cleanup clause I'd never seen enforced. The deadline was impossible, 48 hours. No appeal window listed. At the time, it seemed minor, aggressive but manageable. I sent an email asking for clarification and attached prior approvals. I assumed someone would respond. Someone always did before. No one did this time. Instead, I woke up to trucks. They didn't knock. They didn't announce. They moved fast, like the decision had already been justified. By the time I reached the property line, the fire was already burning. And Cheryl was there. Not directing. Watching. Afterward, the HOA's tone hardened. The follow-up notice didn't mention the fire. It mentioned successful remediation. It warned that further noncompliance would result in escalating enforcement actions, including access restrictions and fines tied to environmental safety. That wording stuck with me. Environmental safety. Because Pine Valley Lake wasn't just a view. It was infrastructure. Water levels were regulated. Shorelines were monitored. And buried deep in the original development documents were clauses most residents had never bothered to read. I didn't realize what that notice really meant. Not yet. What I did realize was that the HOA had stopped treating me like a homeowner and started treating me like a liability. Requests for clarification went unanswered. A routine dock maintenance permit was suddenly delayed, then flagged, then denied pending further review. Normal life kept trying to push through. I cooked. I checked on my mother. I replaced what supplies I could afford. But every day, something small tightened. a warning sticker on my fence, a survey marker near the shoreline that hadn't been there before, a meeting agenda with my address listed under New Business. And then came the letter. This one was certified. It cited bylaws I'd never seen referenced before. It accused my property of posing a risk to lake stability. And it announced the HOA's intent to assume temporary oversight of all adjacent water control features, in the interest of community safety. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about cleanup anymore. They weren't done. They were just getting started. The certified letter didn't slow things down. It accelerated them. Within a week, the HOA posted a temporary safety notice at the edge of my driveway, bright orange and impossible to miss. It warned residents to avoid the shoreline near my property due to unstable conditions. That language traveled fast. Neighbors started whispering. A rumor formed before facts ever had a chance. I felt boxed in. Not angry. Alert. This was no longer about a burned stockpile. It was about control. I requested the documents they cited. Surveys. Engineering reports. Anything. What I got instead was an invoice. An administrative compliance fee for the time they spent reviewing my request. It was small, almost insulting. At the time, it seemed minor. I paid it, thinking it would unlock answers. It didn't. 2 days later, a second notice arrived. This one accused me of obstructing HOA access to water-adjacent assets. I hadn't blocked anything. No gates. No signs. But the notice gave them something they wanted, a pretext. It warned that continued obstruction could result in fines, liens, or emergency intervention. That phrase again. I called my insurance company next. Not to file a claim, just to ask questions. They hadn't heard from the HOA, but they had received an inquiry. About liability. About flood risk. About whether my policy covered downstream impact. I didn't know then, but that call marked me. The next move came quietly. Survey stakes appeared along the shoreline at dawn. Not county-issued. HOA contractors. They didn't ask permission. They didn't leave paperwork. By the time I noticed, they were already gone, little flags snapping in the wind like warnings. I removed them. That should have ended it. It didn't. Within hours, my account was flagged for non-compliance. Dues autopay failed without explanation. A late fee posted instantly. Then another. I emailed. No response. I sent certified mail. It came back unopened. Normal life tried to continue in short bursts. I cooked. I organized what little stockpile I could rebuild. I kept my mother calm when she noticed unfamiliar trucks by the lake. But every calm moment was interrupted by something new. A drone overhead. A notice slipped under my door. A community email thread speculating about safety risks. Then came the meeting agenda. My address wasn't just listed. It was bolded. I didn't attend. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew how these meetings worked. Decisions were framed as consensus before anyone spoke. Instead, I requested the minutes afterward. What I received was a summary that skipped the discussion entirely and went straight to conclusions. They voted to commission an independent assessment of all water control features impacting Pine Valley Lake. Independent. Paid for by whom? Not stated. The assessment triggered more activity. Trucks returned. This time with equipment. They stayed longer. They measured. They photographed. They avoided me. When I asked for credentials, they referred me back to the HOA. That night, I received another letter. This one thicker. Legal language. It claimed my property sat within the zone of influence of the lake's spillway system. It alleged that my past land use could compromise water regulation, and it demanded immediate cooperation, including unrestricted access. I didn't realize what that letter really meant, because attached to it was something else, a deadline. 48 hours. I contacted a local attorney. He skimmed the documents, paused at a paragraph, and told me not to sign anything. He didn't explain why. Just said, "This isn't routine." That was the first time I felt fear. The HOA didn't wait out the deadline. They acted early. A contractor showed up with a temporary fence and began installing it along a section of my shoreline. Not to protect me, to restrict me. When I objected, they cited the emergency clause. When I asked for the order, they said it was forthcoming. It never came. I filed a formal dispute. That triggered retaliation disguised as procedure. My trash service was suspended for safety concerns. My dock permit was revoked retroactively. A lien warning appeared on my account for unpaid, special assessments I'd never been notified about. Each time I pushed back, something worse followed. Then the bank called. They'd received notice of a potential environmental issue affecting collateral. Nothing official yet, just an inquiry. But inquiries have consequences. My credit line froze. Automatic payments failed again. Late fees stacked faster. I thought this was the worst. It wasn't. A county vehicle pulled up one afternoon. Not enforcement, inspection. The officer was polite, confused. He said the HOA had requested confirmation that no unauthorized modifications had been made to the Spillway access path. I told him I hadn't touched anything. He nodded, took notes, and left. That should have helped. Instead, it gave the HOA cover. The next letter claimed the county had verified concerns. That wasn't true, but it sounded official enough. It announced the HOA's intent to assume temporary operational oversight of water control mechanisms to prevent imminent risk. Operational oversight. That was the phrase that kept me up at night. I went digging. Old files. Survey maps. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for clarity. What I found didn't make me feel better. It made everything heavier. Because buried in decades-old paperwork were responsibilities no one talked about anymore. Responsibilities the HOA had never exercised. I didn't tell them what I'd found. The HOA escalated again. This time publicly. A community alert warned of a possible controlled water level adjustment scheduled within the week. It framed the move as precautionary, temporary, necessary. I knew enough by then to know what that meant. Adjustments affect pressure. Pressure affects structures. And structures don't fail evenly. I requested an injunction. Emergency. Limited. Just to pause action until documentation could be reviewed. The response came fast. Denied. The reason cited wasn't jurisdiction. It was standing. According to the HOA, I no longer had it. They claimed my property's status was under review. That night, I stood by the lake and watched workers unload equipment near the Spillway gate. Not county. HOA. They were calm. Confident. Like they'd already won. A final notice hit my inbox at midnight. It declared an emergency drawdown authorized by the board, effective immediately. It revoked my access to the shoreline for safety. And it warned that interference would be treated as obstruction. That was the moment I understood. They weren't bluffing anymore. They had crossed into something they couldn't undo. And once the water started moving, nothing in Pine Valley was going to stay the same. The moment the Spillway gate moved, everything accelerated beyond anyone's ability to pretend this was procedural. The HOA called it an emergency drawdown, but what they initiated wasn't a gentle adjustment. It was abrupt. Uneven. I could see it in the water line within minutes. The lake didn't lower cleanly. It pulled. Pressure shifted toward the southern embankment, the side lined with the newest, most expensive homes. The same homes Cheryl had praised in every newsletter as flagship investments. I didn't touch the controls. I didn't have to. Their authorization triggered the mechanism automatically once certain thresholds were crossed. Thresholds defined in documents older than the HOA itself. What I did do was file something they never expected. At the same time the water began moving, a recorded notice hit the county clerk's office. A deed-based assertion of control over the Pine Valley Spillway, dated 1962, complete with surveys, maintenance covenants, and a clause that hadn't been cited in any HOA bylaw because it superseded all of them. It wasn't symbolic. It was operational. I didn't realize what that filing would set in motion. Within an hour, the HOA's emergency authority evaporated. Not because they admitted fault, but because they never had it to begin with. Their oversight only applied if no prior controlling interest existed. Mine did. And they'd ignored it in writing. The water kept moving. By mid-afternoon, the shoreline near the luxury homes started to soften. Lawns sagged. Decorative retaining walls leaned. One dock shifted just enough to snap its anchors. Phones came out. Videos started circulating. The same neighbors who had avoided eye contact were now staring at the lake like it had betrayed them. The HOA scrambled. Emails flew. Notices contradicted each other. First, they claimed the drawdown was temporary. Then they blamed an unexpected structural response. Finally, they went silent. That silence didn't last. Emergency services arrived, not to stop flooding, but to document damage. County engineers followed. They didn't look confused. They looked alarmed. Because the spillway wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do when unauthorized parties interfered. I watched Cheryl arrive late, stepping carefully over mud that hadn't been there that morning. Her confidence didn't survive the walk. She kept checking her phone, pacing, gesturing. But no one was taking cues from her anymore. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county. A formal notice acknowledging receipt of my filing and instructing all third parties to cease operations pending review. It referenced potential liability for unauthorized water management and warned of civil and criminal exposure if interference continued. That was the turning point. Because the HOA had already interfered. The assessment reports they'd commissioned came back at the worst possible time. Not for me, for them. The reports confirmed the spillway's zone of influence extended directly beneath 3 of the lakefront homes. Homes built after the HOA approved grading changes without updating hydrological impact studies. Those approvals had names attached. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. I felt weight. Because what was happening now couldn't be undone. Water doesn't negotiate. Paperwork doesn't float. The HOA tried to regain control by calling an emergency board session. The agenda leaked before it ended. They planned to retroactively fine me for failure to disclose infrastructure authority. The irony was almost painful. They were accusing me of not telling them about rights they'd been warned about multiple times. At the same time, insurers began pulling out. Policies were flagged. Coverage questioned. Deductibles skyrocketed. The phrase, man-made event, started appearing in emails no one wanted to read. Then came the public exposure. A local reporter picked up the footage. The headline didn't mention me. It mentioned HOA mismanagement triggers flooding risk. The article included excerpts from the deed filing, screenshots of HOA notices, a timeline that didn't favor the people in charge. Cheryl's name was printed more than once. The HOA's final power move came that night. A cease and desist notice accusing me of intentional sabotage. It was aggressive, poorly timed, and fatal, because attached to it was an admission. They acknowledged awareness of the spillway's ownership clause, dating back months. They claimed they'd chosen to proceed anyway under emergency authority. Authority they didn't have. My attorney didn't need to respond. The document responded for us. The county issued a stop work order before sunrise. All HOA operations near the lake were frozen. Fines were suspended. Liens paused. Access restrictions lifted. The board was instructed to preserve records and communications. Preserve was a dangerous word for them. As the water stabilized, the damage became undeniable. Basements seeped. Electrical systems shorted. Landscaping collapsed. The lakefront aesthetic, the selling point, was gone. And the HOA's insurance carrier issued a reservation of rights letter that made one thing clear: this wouldn't be covered quietly. The board tried to shift blame downward. Contractors, consultants, anyone but themselves. But the paper trail didn't cooperate. Every escalation, every ignored warning, every rushed vote. It was all documented. I didn't realize how much they'd underestimated that. The final blow didn't come from me. It came from within. One board member resigned publicly, citing ethical concerns. Another retained separate counsel. The unity they'd projected cracked instantly. Emergency meetings turned into finger-pointing sessions. Authority fractured. And through it all, the spillway remained under my control. Silent. Immovable. Untouched. The HOA had burned my winter stockpile to assert power. In response, they triggered a system that stripped them of it. As night fell over Pine Valley, the lake reflected lights from homes no longer sure they were safe. And I understood something then that I hadn't at the beginning. This wasn't the end. This was the moment everything irreversible had already happened. And the consequences were just starting to surface. It took months for everything to settle, but the moment the spillway stopped moving, the direction of power never shifted back. The HOA tried to project control in the days that followed. Carefully worded updates went out to residents, framing the flooding as an unforeseen infrastructure interaction. They avoided names. They avoided responsibility. But the community had already seen too much. The damage was visible. The paper trail was public. And silence, in a place built on appearances, spoke louder than any notice. The county review moved faster than anyone expected. Once the stop work order was issued, the HOA's authority over anything water-related was officially suspended. That alone changed everything. The board could still send letters, still threaten fines, still posture, but without enforcement teeth, those notices landed differently. People started pushing back. Requests that had once been ignored were suddenly copied to attorneys. Meetings that had once been empty filled with homeowners asking questions the board couldn't answer cleanly. Insurance fallout came next. 3 lakefront homes were deemed partially uninsurable until structural assessments were completed. One policy was canceled outright. Another carrier issued a non-renewal notice citing avoidable governance risk. Those words didn't just describe damage. They described leadership. And insurers don't soften language. The HOA's master policy entered dispute. Coverage was challenged on the grounds that the board knowingly exceeded its authority. Defense costs alone began draining reserves. Special assessments were proposed, then withdrawn after backlash. The same residents who had applauded aggressive enforcement now realized they were being asked to pay for it. That was when the lawsuit started. Not from me. From within. 2 homeowners filed claims against the HOA for negligence. Another alleged misrepresentation during purchase, citing undisclosed hydrological risks. Subpoenas followed. Emails surfaced. Meeting minutes that had once been summaries were now reconstructed in detail. The emergency clause that had justified everything unraveled under scrutiny. Cheryl resigned quietly. There was no announcement. No farewell message. Just a name removed from the board roster and replaced with vacant. Her absence was louder than her presence ever had been. Within weeks, 2 more board members stepped down. One cited health reasons. The other simply stopped responding. A special election was held under county supervision. New board members were installed with restrictions, limited authority, mandatory training, and oversight on any action affecting shared infrastructure. The HOA survived, but it shrank. Its confidence never recovered. My own situation resolved in parallel. Every fine levied against my account was formally voided. Late fees reversed. Liens rescinded. The notice attempting to strip my standing was withdrawn in writing. The HOA acknowledged, without apology, that my property rights over the spillway were valid and exclusive. That acknowledgement mattered more than money. The county entered into a direct communication agreement with me regarding water management. Not a partnership. A recognition. The spillway was no longer a political tool. It was infrastructure again. Controlled. Documented. Quiet. Rebuilding the winter stockpile took time. Some of it was replaced through insurance. Some through help I hadn't expected. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact started dropping things off. Firewood, supplies, handwritten notes. No speeches. Just small gestures that said they understood now. My mother never fully grasped what had happened. But she noticed the calm return. The trucks stopped coming. The notices stopped appearing. Routine settled back into place, fragile but intact. That mattered more than any victory. The lakefront homes changed hands within a year. One sold at a loss after disclosure requirements scared off buyers. Another remained vacant, its owner tied up in litigation with the HOA's insurer. The flagship Image Pine Valley had tried to build fractured permanently. You could still see the lake. You just couldn't ignore what lay beneath it anymore. Community meetings became quieter. Not calmer, more careful. People read documents now. They asked where authority came from, not just how it was enforced. The HOA still existed, but it no longer ruled by momentum. Every action required explanation. Every rule invited scrutiny. As for me, I stayed where I was. There were offers. Developers circled once word spread that my land sat at the center of everything. I declined all of them. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. This land had already been fought over. It didn't need to be sold to justify its value. What stayed with me most wasn't the flooding or the legal reversal or even the quiet downfall of the board. It was how easily the situation had escalated in the first place. How quickly cleanup turned into authority. How a single unchecked decision snowballed into irreversible consequences. The HOA never apologized for burning my winter stockpile. They didn't have to. The cost of that choice followed them everywhere. Into courtrooms, balance sheets, and living rooms filled with water damage and regret. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up taped to a gate. Sometimes it hides in a clause no one bothers to read. And sometimes, it burns what you need most, assuming you won't be able to respond. They assumed wrong. What seemed like the end was really just the beginning of accountability. And what they treated as a minor rule enforcement revealed something much larger about how authority is abused when no one thinks it will be challenged. If a group of neighbors with clipboards and bylaws can nearly erase someone's stability without consequence, until the moment they're stopped, what does that say about the systems we trust to protect us? And if it happened in Pine Valley, could it happen where you live?